Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the California ISO, I'd like to welcome you to the 2023 Interconnection Process Enhancement Stakeholder Call to kick off Track 2 of this initiative and to provide an overview of the discussion paper. My name is Caitlin McGee, representing the Stakeholder Affairs Group here at the ISO, and I'll be facilitating today's meeting. I'm also joined by Danielle Mills, Principal of Infrastructure Policy, Bob Emmert, Senior Manager of Interconnection Resources, and Jason Foster, Manager of Queue Management. As a reminder, the presentation and agenda for this meeting is posted to the Policy Initiatives webpage. This can be found under the Stay Informed tab of the California ISO's webpage. Next slide, please. Before we get started today, a few housekeeping reminders. This call is being recorded for informational and convenience purposes only. Any related transcription should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. We really hope to run this meeting in a way that it stimulates dialogue and engage different perspectives, but we also do ask that you keep comments professional and respectful and to try to refrain from repeating what has already been said today. Next slide, please. And if you'd like to ask a question or make a comment throughout our meeting today, there are a few ways to do so. If you're connected through the audio using your computer or the Call Me option, you can click the raise hand icon down at the bottom right toolbar. And then you can also type your question or comment into the chat box and I will read it aloud. If you're connected through the audio only line, you can press #2 and that'll set you up to add your name to the queue. When you're making your comments or questions today, please remember to state your name and affiliation beforehand. If at any time today you need technical assistance during the meeting, you can send a chat to the event producer. Next slide, please. So today's agenda, we have quite a full meeting today. We'll start off with Danielle to take us through, the ISO 2023 initiative introduction. Bob will walk us through the discussion paper, mostly focused on our problem statement number 1, and Jason will take us through problem statement number 2. And then I'll wrap it out with next steps and an overview of the initiative schedule. Next slide. And then just a reminder, this is an overview of the ISO's policy initiative stakeholder process. As you can see here, we're at the beginning of this process, really starting with the discussion paper and moving into the working groups shortly after. Next slide. So with that, I wanted to take a moment and pass it over to Neil Miller, our Vice President of Infrastructure and Operations, and Joanne Serena, Vice President of Stakeholder Engagement and Customer Experience. They're going to provide us with some introductory remarks. So go ahead and take it away, Neil and Joanne.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much, Caitlin. I'll jump in first here. And first, on behalf of the ISO, I just want to thank all of you for participating in the stakeholder process. This is a critical issue for us as we're facing not just the challenges of the significant volume of projects arriving in our interconnection queue, but setting the stage for managing the throughput of new development that we need to sustain year over year for the next decade and beyond. We do see this effort critical to establishing some transformational change that is necessary to achieve those goals, to achieve the state's clean energy goals reliably. And because of that, we do see needing to make, like I said, these broader transformational changes that will require the active participation of the broad stakeholder community to ensure that the complete spectrum of interests are taken care of as we move through this initiative. Now, to help achieve that, the team has already done some pivoting in terms of the process being taken and the stakeholder consultation in the initiative itself. So I'll just give a last thank you and then turn it over to Joanne Serena to talk about that different approach on stakeholder experience. Joanne?
Great, thank you, Neil, and good afternoon, everybody. I appreciate the opportunity to talk a little bit more about our stakeholder process. and how we are continuing to evolve and improve our stakeholder process. So one of the things that we are doing here with this initiative is leveraging the concept of working groups. And one of the things that we have found with working groups with other initiatives is that it really allows for stakeholders to engage more robustly in terms of defining the problem statement and really helping us define what the solution set looks like. So I know that there's been quite a bit of work already done on this initiative, but I think it's early enough in the process that we're able to leverage and bring in some working group sessions so that stakeholders can really absorb what we believe is the problem statement and ensure that it aligns with the perspectives of stakeholders. And then we will move into the actual issue paper and straw proposal through some subsequent working group sessions. So they've been very, I think, helpful. Maybe some of you have participated in some of those working groups for other initiatives, and so you may have some experience with those. But we're really looking forward to being able to leverage that for this initiative. So I believe the team has essentially structured the paper that we're going to take a look at today as a way to open up the dialogue around the problem statements. And as Neil mentioned, this is an important initiative really to reform our interconnection processes. I know for the past few years we've done a number of iterations to enhance the processes, but as I think we have found with the high volume of interconnections, we really need to take a harder look and really make some big changes. And so we want to do this with the stakeholders as part of that journey. And so we look forward to more robust engagement, with all of you. And I'm happy to certainly take any questions about the process and what it looks like. I think hopefully we answered a couple of the questions in the chat around the discussion paper.
Give it a few seconds. If anybody chooses to raise their hand, you can use the icon at the bottom right of the screen or drop your question in the chat and I'll read it aloud. But I think at this time there are no questions, Joanne.
All right. Well, we really do appreciate stakeholders' interest in this initiative. As Neil said, it's really, really important as we move forward. We have a very robust transmission plan over the next 10, 20 years. A lot of changes are going to be coming based on that plan, and we want to make sure we have a good process in place to be able to support that. So we look forward to the stakeholders' feedback and input as we go through this problem statement. All right, thank you. Any other comments, Neil, that I missed?
No, thank you very much for commenting on that, Joanne. And I think we now turn it over to Danielle to get into the content. So thank you.
Great, thanks.
Sounds good. Well, thank you, Caitlin, Neil, and Joanne for setting the tone. We are very much looking forward to jumping into this stakeholder process with all of you. And if we can just advance the slide, I think one thing we want to emphasize here is that we do understand the importance and the role of this interconnection process enhancements cycle in the broader picture of clean energy deployment in California. So we see this as fitting into sort of the next phase of the process of implementing the Memorandum of Understanding that was signed in December of 2022 between the ISO, CEC, and CPUC, which really seeks to tighten some of these linkages between transmission planning, resource procurement, interconnection, and then continuing that cycle in an iterative way that helps us get to our goals. Obviously, on the heels of the TPP, which is just past interconnection process enhancements, are sort of the next critical step. And we really want to emphasize the importance of making sure that we're getting these projects interconnected and working on project execution as they move through this cycle. And as we, as entities work through this with you all. So we can go on to the next slide, please. And obviously, current circumstances have also reinforced the need for some more significant and transformative changes within the Interconnection Process Enhancements Initiative and just in interconnection in general. As many of you know, the CPUC resource portfolios are calling for a very significant and aggressive build-out of new capacity per year. We're looking at over 7,000 megawatts per year in this next planning cycle. But what we've seen from cluster 15 and previous recent clusters as well is that we're getting interconnection requests that far exceed the need and the demand for this new energy. So cluster 15, as an example, saw 541 individual interconnection requests, totaling about 354 gigawatts worth of power. And then if you look at cluster 14 and prior queues as well, there were already 464 active projects in the queue, totaling about 188 gigawatts. So just the volume of existing interconnection requests and new interconnection requests is something we need to look at, and we'd like your help in trying to define the challenges so that we can define solutions that match those challenges. The last thing I want to note here about the queue data that we have right now is just the areas where a lot of these interconnection requests are appearing and existing applications exist. Many of these requests are in parts of the state where we don't have available transmission capacity. So we're trying to, as the MOU encourages, we're trying to kind of connect the transmission planning process and available transmission capacity with the areas where resources will be interconnected. Next slide, please. And just to recap on where we are in this process, I think many of you participated in and followed track 1, which focused on more immediate adjustments to the cluster 15 schedule, allowing for completion of the cluster 14 phase 2 studies and sort of paving the way for track 2 changes to be put in place. So the finalization of track 1 and the adoption of track 1 in May of this year sort of enables us to move forward and look at more significant and transformative changes in track 2, where we'll focus on changes to the cluster study process and really try to work to implement those goals that I outlined from the MOU. We are working to bring track 2 to the ISO Board of Governors in December of this year. We want to make sure that we're completing this effort in time to get back to the cluster 15 interconnection request validation and study processes. So that is the timeline that we're working under, and you know, it's going to be intensive at times. We do want to be open to a lot of new ideas, but we also realize that this is going to be an intensive process, not only for us, but for stakeholders who have a lot of concerns and needs to move forward with this as well. Next slide, please. And then one more picture just to sort of set the context of where we are between the IPE initiative and also to acknowledge an additional kind of peripheral or parallel initiative, which is the Delivery Assessment Methodology Initiative. So we talked about the relationship between Interconnection Process Enhancements Track 1 and 2, but I also want to just make everyone aware that there are a number of issues that are related to what we'll be talking about here in IPE Track 2 that will be addressed more in the Deliverability Assessment Methodology Initiative. We're working those two processes or initiatives in parallel, so the timing will be aligned so that we can make sure that the changes that we're making in IPE will also be reflected in the changes that are made to the Deliverability Assessment Methodology. And that will also seek Board of Governors approval in 2023 as well. Next slide, please. Okay, so to jump into some of the substance of what we'll be talking about today, and I think the first area where we'd really like feedback from stakeholders, we proposed in the discussion paper a number of principles for this Interconnection Process Enhancements Initiative. And we think that these principles, or that having a set of principles, is important to helping us really focus solutions that are going to be workable for the greatest number of parties and for the ISO. So the principles that we proposed are to, going back to the MOU, they're closely aligned with the work in the MOU. First, we want to prioritize interconnection in zones where transmission capacity already exists or has been approved in the latest round of the TPP. And again, these are high-level principles, so we don't have a lot of specifics behind these, but this is just sort of a general direction that we're trying to move things in. Number two, we also want to limit the amount of studies to the amount of reasonable capacity volumes that can be interconnected in those areas. So we want to align both locations and volumes to make this manageable and make sure that we're getting, projects online in the time frame that is required by state planning initiatives. Third, we want to align interconnection and transmission plan deliverability processes and procurement functions, and this is where a lot of the work between the IPE and the deliverability assessment methodology will appear. But we do think that it's important to have interconnection and transmission plan deliverability processes aligned. And then fourth, we want to enhance the post-study queue management procedures. So if you look back at that previous slide, and you don't have to move it on the WebEx, but if you go back to that initial slide that showed the most recent queue information, we recognize that there are a lot of existing projects in the queue right now, and we want to make sure that those projects have the greatest chance of moving forward, and if they're not moving forward, that they're not holding other progress up or projects up. In addition to these principles, we obviously have to be sure that we continue to ensure open access, and we want to create a process that's manageable and sustainable both for us and for all of you. So again, we'll invite stakeholder feedback on these principles. I think written feedback, high level, whether we're missing anything or whether there are additional considerations, we would really appreciate in the written feedback in the next week or so, but also today on this discussion. And we can jump into the problem statements, or Caitlin, I don't know if you had any questions that you wanted to take now.
Yeah, we do have a few questions. So I see Susan Schneider with Phoenix Consulting has her hand raised. Could we open up her line, please?
Consulting. I just had a couple of process questions. I appreciate your stopping for to take them here. For cluster 15, the CAISO had said that they were going to be putting out a list of projects that had passed the completeness review. And I thought that that list was going to be completed somewhere around May 1st, I think, when that review was going to be completed. And it's already June and we haven't seen it yet. Do you have any idea when those projects, that list or that information may be released?
Hi, this is Bob Emmert. I can handle that. Yeah, we're working on that. We had some passing back and forth of WDAP projects and so forth that we wanted to make sure were fully completed before we move forward with publicizing the list. So we're working on the list now, and I anticipate we should be able to post that within a week or so.
Okay. Bob, do you know, I mean, it would be extremely helpful given these transmission zones, which is a little bit of a, I wouldn't call it a new concept, but it's in the TPP, in the transmission plan. Is there going to be any indication either in the list or any other way to convey the information to the developers, whether or which for each of the projects, which transmission zone they might be in, so that they might be able to see, you know, how much capacity there might be, at least based on the transmission plan, or how, you know, how many other projects might be in their zone compared to the, is there going to be any tie in the information release to the transmission zones that are so key in the proposal here?
Well, I anticipate as we start to kind of hone in on what the final proposal is going to be looking like, that one of the topics of discussion will be what kind of information will stakeholders need to be operating within that new paradigm that we're seeking to develop here. So I think it's a little bit premature to be talking about that type of information, but, you know, that is one component that, you know, since it is one of our foundational principles, I'm sure we'll carry through, and we'll just have to work through the process of what exactly stakeholders are most interested in seeing, so that they can have all the information that they need to work in identifying and kind of scoping out their projects.
Well, I mean, given the strong dependence of all the proposals here on making sure that that you're processing or prioritizing projects in zones, I'm just reading your first bullet point here, zones where transmission capacity exists or new transmission has been approved, I think it would be extremely helpful for anyone who's got a Cluster 15 application to know whether they were in one of those zones or whether their application is sort of hanging out, I should say out in left field, but basically is located in an area where this does not apply and may, you know, I mean, it would be better to know this like ASAP than to wait a year to find out whether your project is in a zone where there's not any capacity anyway.
Okay, well, please put that in your comments.
Okay, thanks. And I had just one more question. On slide 11, which I guess is right here. The idea that that you're going to either limit studies or limit, you know, even in the future, perhaps applications to areas where transmission capacity exists or new transmission is approved. It seems like that might take out a key element of the CPUC's development of the portfolios in the first place, where they do look at commercial interest, meaning where projects are, you know, in doing bus bar mapping, for example, where projects are that are in the queue. And if you aren't accepting applications, except in areas where the capacity exists or new transmission has been approved, how have you given any thought to how the signal of commercial interest in other areas would actually sort of make it through that process into the portfolio development?
Well, this is Bob again. I'll take a shot at that. We have had discussions with the CPUC related to that very topic, so that's something that they are going to be involved in, as well as other stakeholders, in figuring out the best way to deal with that particular issue. So that'll be something, again, yet to be determined, but it'll be an issue that we definitely need to work through.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Bob. That's all I've got. Sorry.
All right, we do also have a hand raised from Brian Turner with Advanced Energy United. Go ahead.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Thanks. So I had a question about the principles here. Going back to the MOU with the CEC and CPUC in the procurement and interconnection part of that, the ISO committed to prioritizing interconnection activities to support the geographic locations, which I'm seeing here in the principles, but it also says prioritize resources with the operational characteristics consistent with the resource planning conducted at the CEC and CPUC. And I'm not seeing that here in the principles or in the proposed activities, and I was just wondering if you could address here in the principles, and then the question continues as we get into the specific proposals about that operational characteristics part.
Thanks, Brian. I think that's a good point and something that we should definitely consider including here. I don't think there was any resistance to it, so it's helpful feedback, and I think we can continue to discuss that as we refine these principles.
Right, and then there has been an update to the WebEx platform for folks who have done these virtual meetings before. Will notice that the mute icon locks, so our event producer went ahead and put a note in the chat there just to make sure folks don't get blocked from making their comment. So let's move on to Rayanne Quadro with Gridwell.
Thank you so much. This is Rayanne Quadro with Gridwell on behalf of EDFR. I want to limit my comment here just to the principles and want to ask, you know, how much additional sort of flexibility there is with these principles. I hope it's not limited to the MOU, I guess is what I'm saying. I think stakeholders will have some input into priorities they have. One thing I would really like to see added to the principles is discussion of timelines, specifically study timelines. The CAISO study process right now is almost 3 years, and I think that really eats into a lot of productive development time, especially if on the final end we're going to be talking about really harsh queue management limits for 7 years in the queue. And so I think putting some timeline goals at this high level would give that sort of the priority it needs as we move forward.
That's helpful, thanks. I think in terms of your question about how limited these principles need to be or how open to feedback we are very open to feedback. I just want to maybe emphasize the importance of these principles or how we plan to use them, which is to help us kind of evaluate different types of proposals in terms of whether they're going to keep us on track toward the goal of having an interconnection process that sort of adheres to the goals of the MOU, but is also manageable and sustainable to us and passable with FERC. And ensuring open access and things like that. So I think we want the principles to help guide the discussion, and to the extent that you have suggestions of kind of some sideboards to the conversations that we can set as principles, we're very, very open to those.
Thanks, Danielle. I'm really excited to hear that too. Sometimes these interconnection processes can feel on the stakeholder initiative space like a democratic vote. If you get enough people to come in and oppose or support a process, and it'll get pushed through. And a qualitative review is really what's needed for an effort this large. And I think, maybe timelines is the wrong way to say it, but efficiency is really important, and timeline experience on both ends, both the CAISOs and stakeholders is important. So I will provide in my comments sort of the suggestion to add that into the principles.
So I just wanted, this is Joanne Serena, so I just wanted to just express thank you for those comments. And I do think that the main intent of the working groups is to sort of address what you just mentioned in terms of feeling that stakeholders aren't necessarily always feeling heard. And so that is our objective here in terms of how we're approaching this initiative. And I think to Danielle's point, we can refine these principles to make sure that we all agree on what the key guardrails are. Since we certainly do want to make sure we are successful and in meeting our timelines, right, in terms of project delivery and value delivery. So I think we're open to what makes sense to make sure everybody's needs are met.
Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to the rest of the meeting.
Great, thanks.
I think just one other note on a kind of practical level is as we think through these principles, we also have to think through the roles identified in the MOU. And so I just want to highlight too that some of this information is handed to us through the CPUC, through the IRP busbar mapping process, and through their portfolios. So we want to just be sensitive to whose role fits and where, and what's appropriate to put in the interconnection and what might be better placed elsewhere. But I think open to all of it and discussing all of it with all of you.
All right. We also do have a hand raised from Doug Carpa with Peninsula Clean Energy. Go ahead.
Hi, Doug Carpa, Peninsula Clean Energy. Yeah, thank you so much for the process. I'm looking forward to all of this and, of course, providing as much help as I can on particularly number 3. I did have a question actually about if there's like one of the topics or principles here focuses on costs to developers, and I freely admit this is an area I'm pretty naive about, but I know sort of anecdotally that the high variability of the final costs at the back end can cause projects to drop out. And one of the things that I'm looking at here is just sort of a scenario of we limit the number of projects being studied, and then some number of those are going to get really high cost estimates and then drop out late in the process when we've sort of limited things up front. And so that's sort of that project loss because of variable costs is somewhat of a concern, and I'm just wondering if there's any conversation or thought around, like, I don't know, socializing it out to like, oh, maybe there should be just a flat fee that covers everybody's costs, and yeah, that's higher for some people, but it'll be lower for some, and those sorts of cost allocation issues among, or whether you're just like constrained in ways that we can't really address that.
We haven't really discussed that as a potential principle, but I think that's the type of thing that makes sense to think through and explore together. So I think feedback on that would be helpful. We certainly want to be sensitive to costs, but recognize too that that can be, a driver in some of this. And so we want to be sensitive to that. I do think we want to also be very sensitive to ratepayer costs as well. So those are all helpful comments and things to think about.
Okay, we have a comment from Dariush Shukramati. Go ahead.
Hi, this is Dariush Shukramati. Can you hear me?
Yes. Go ahead.
Okay. By the way, I'm with Gridbyte representing California Wind Energy Association. When it comes to such directed central planning type interconnection process, one issue that we have seen in the past several cycles has been people who interconnect at a particular zone, even though somehow transmission capacity will apply to interconnect in a particular zone, even though there is no transmission capacity effectively defined as delivered capacity happen to be in that zone or in that area or a steady area. And then as part of the TPP process, CAISO approves a transmission project that makes that area very effectively desirable. And this has happened in Fresno, especially by approval of Manning Substation. And while Manning Substation probably was not, Fresno area was an area where a project should not file an interconnection application prior to approval of Manning Substation. So all of a sudden, projects who happen to be in the queue at the wrong area when it comes to deliverability allocation, which happens at the tail end of the process, are the main beneficiary or the main stars of the show with an area which was not a good area to start with. And this has happened a few times. Are you going to sort of make sure that these type of surprises do not happen, and are you going to foresee the future far enough in the future so that you would prevent people from going to areas as part of this central planning type arrangement that will never get transmission upgrade? Again, as it happens, people who may be at the wrong area as part of the interconnection process, when it was free for open access type of arrangement, they could end up in a place where transmission is not available. You would not have picked it, but all of a sudden became available in nick of time when there is deliverability allocation process going on. So how are you going to manage that arrangement in a way that you basically do not make it a central planning process, everything decided at a central location, or and allow for the fact that when it comes to TPP, you may upgrade transmission where you were not predicting 2-3 years ago when you told people where to go for interconnection.
Dariush, I think that you raise a legitimate concern. I think it's the type of thing that we don't have the details on right now, but that's why we're initiating this process. So we do want to kind of get into some of that probably more in the working group meetings. I think if we can maybe try to focus on the principles for the remaining questions, some of this may become clearer as we get into problem statements and some of the proposed concepts. And then again, like this is the substance and the meat of the conversation that we want to have in a couple of weeks. So thank you for putting that all forward.
Thank you.
And this is Bob Emmert. I'd like to just kind of add on to that, you know, Jerry, the question that you're raising is something that, you know, as we discussed, will be addressed within the working group. So as these kind of questions come to mind, these are things that we're hoping that all stakeholders will bring up at the working group meetings, but also bring to the working group meetings what they think are the best solutions for those questions and issues that you're raising. So, you know, we appreciate the questions, and we'll be looking forward to hearing you bring forth what you think is the best solution for that issue and other issues that you are concerned with.
Yeah, so this is Joanne Streen again. I'll just add on to what Bob said is that's sort of the intent of the working groups, and we welcome stakeholders even proposing solutions that the working groups can evaluate and listen to. So we would definitely encourage proposals from you and others on how to solve these kinds of issues.
All right, thanks everyone. And again, to Danielle's point, we are just pausing here to talk about the principles. So we do have a few hands up. We do just ask that your comments and questions are in regards to the principles. We'll have plenty of opportunity throughout today's presentation to focus on our two problem statements and the concepts to follow our presentation. So with that, I will jump over to Linda Wright, who has her hand up on the line. Please open that line.
I do not have a question. Thank you.
Okay. And then Kathleen Colbert.
Great, thank you. This is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I see some head nods. Okay, great. It's kind of fun to see you on video, by the way. So I do have questions, but also I have 3 questions on the principles. But before I do that, I wanted just to share some positive reinforcement. I thought this was really useful. I thought this was a really good paper and a great way to start this discussion, but I particularly like this principles section, so I just wanted to say thank you for that and kind of reinforce. And I heard, Joanne, what you said, and just, you know, this is very helpful, and so to say thank you for that. As I thought through, and I tried to spend some time thinking through it and seeing if I had any questions, making sure I understand them. So my first question for you is on the prioritizing interconnection in zones where transmission capacity exists or new transmission has been approved. I just wanted to clarify that when you mention new transmission that has been approved, that includes all transmission project types, reliability, policy, and economic. It's the full set of all of the transmission projects approved in the plan.
Thanks, Kathleen. I think that's an area of detail that we have not gone into intentionally in the concepts in the discussion paper. I think, you know, that is a direction that we probably need to explore with all of you. You know, what kinds of constraints we put on it, or how broad to leave it. So would encourage feedback on that. But right now we don't have that defined in any way.
No, that's helpful. To know that's an open question. And I will look forward to hopefully talking about that and teasing that out more at the working group that's coming up. I think it is a really important question. And if we're going to be using this as selection criteria or evaluation criteria, I think we'll need to define that. So that's great, very helpful. My second question is related. I think these principles seemed very reasonable to start with on our first review. The one thing that niggled at me has to do with this idea of the types of transmission that are approved. I think it should be all of them, whatever that transmission capacity is that we're planning on, available headroom, whenever we do an interconnection process. But to confirm that would be helpful. But the other thing is that this will only be as effective as confidence that we are studying in the TPP and the transmission plan, the projects that we need to study for various reasons. So there is a bit of a feedback loop from the transmission planning process that I believe is outside the scope of like this particular paper, but I'd like to explore as a working group if there is some principle at least that we could incorporate, that in addition to prioritizing once the transmission is set, we need to ensure that the transmission studies are studying a robust set are studying the full set that they need to study. And there is a specific category of items that I know we've raised in the transmission planning process enhancements effort. And so I'm also trying to figure out process-wise, we've been asking for some additional enhancements on the TPP to have that confidence in that venue. This is a slightly different scope of work here, but how do we connect them to make sure that the TPP is enhanced to ensure we're studying all the projects that need to be studied? And I'm not trying to be coy. I'm thinking about this set of, there's a lot of commercial interest in different locations that may not be represented fully in the portfolios or the policy sensitivities, but that are in direct response to an economic signal that exists. And so how do we get the economic studies to incorporate a need to do that? And we had talked about things like if there are frequent zones that do not have sufficient headroom in interconnection, perhaps the TPP would study it. Just to give you an example of some of the feedback and the interconnectivity of this topic. So I think I'd like to request that we spend some time talking about it and figuring out what's in scope here, what's in scope there, and what that process plan is. Yeah, so I'll stop there, pause, see if you have any follow-up questions.
I think those are great questions to continue to explore in the work group.
Awesome, that's awesome. The last question that I had for you has to do with number 3. So this one, I thought this principle was a good principle. There is a lot of information that the CAISO produces that is available to the procurement functions that are being referenced. I definitely think we need to put more around what you mean by this principle. It wasn't clear to me exactly what this would mean. And I had one risk I wanted to flag, that we need to be mindful that there is a separation of function between the transmission arm and the merchant arms within these ELIS, within the load serving entities that have both of these functions. And so we'll have to figure out if part of the problem is an information flow and talk through it from a process perspective, not just what information are you trying to give, but is it getting to the right part of the entity? And does that procurement function, do they understand how to use that information? Is it digestible? Is it usable? So I think those are some additional things that we should unpack on number 3, just to make sure we're not getting crosswise with any separation of function obligations that they're subject to.
Thanks, Kathleen. I think that's all really good feedback, and would encourage you to put it in writing just so that we can make sure we're capturing it and making space to discuss it in some of the work groups. And also, if you have specific thoughts on kind of how to address all of those concerns, would welcome a proposal from you also in the working group discussion.
Yeah, understood. No, thank you. I appreciate the clarifications. It will help me as I draft my comments.
Thanks.
Okay, Ryan Miller with Next Era Energy Resources. Go ahead.
Go ahead, your line has been unmuted.
Hi, can you guys hear me okay?
Yes,
Hello?
we can hear you. Go ahead.
Great, thank you. Really appreciate the CAISO's recognition of the importance of this topic and the need to prioritize solutions to the issues these interconnection requests are creating. In looking at these principles, I wondered if the CAISO could provide some more context for your decision to only evaluate cluster 15 and future clusters in this IPE reform track and not contemplating retroactive application of previous clusters. I think one thing we're grappling with is if the goal is really to unclog the queue and you don't address any of the projects of previous clusters that may not be viable and they continue to linger because of inherent limitations associated with the process, it seems like the process changes that are going to benefit from reform are going to be so far out that they aren't really going to resolve the immediate problem. And I know this has been discussed maybe briefly in track 1, but I think it's relevant to bring up here. And I'm hoping that you can just provide a little bit more context for that.
Thanks, Ryan. This is Jason Foster. Yeah, the managing the queue section of the proposal and problem statement number 2 is really intended to identify what opportunities we have to, help projects move along in the queue, or if they're not moving along, how do we, politely remove them from the queue. So that's a bit of retroactive activity or action that would be required, and then we just have to figure out how to and what policies can we put in place to take those actions. And then, of course, then we set forward actions and activities on cluster 15 and going forward. So certainly something we want to entertain and open to ideas and suggested solutions, either in writing or at the work groups.
And maybe just to kind of build on that point, one of the ways that we've contemplated characterizing these work groups or categorizing these work groups is to focus the discussion on 2 issues, one of which is the intake of interconnection requests, and the second, which is management of projects that are already in the queue and how we can kind of help move them along faster. So that's, you may see when we structure the work groups that there are specific conversations around those 2, that sort of split of projects that are new to the queue and projects that have been in the queue before cluster 15. So it's good feedback, thank you.
All right, and then we have Shashank Barag from Clearway Energy Group.
Sean, go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Thanks. Appreciate CAISO's effort and thoughtfulness in coming out with these principles. This is a similar question to Ryan's. I specifically want to call out principle 3 here about aligning interconnection and TPD allocation process with LSE resource procurement. Curious to hear CAISO's thoughts on applying this for cluster 15, because this is, in our opinion, a crucial principle for cluster 14 and making those projects valuable assets for anything right beyond the midterm reliability procurement horizon. So Jason, any thoughts on whether this principle will be applied into the queue management problem statement as well? And what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, Sushan, this is Jason. I would actually punt this to Bob and say, really this is the purpose of these discussions, is try to figure out how to align that. Bob, do you have any thoughts?
Well, just so you know, the genesis of this comes out of the MOU between the ISO and the CPUC and the CEC. So while procurement for the jurisdictional load-serving entities is outside of the purview of the ISO, it's something that the MOU recognized we need to do better at to facilitate the process, just knowing how the volumes of capacity that we need to bring on in the years ahead, we need to do better at various components than we have done in the past, and this is one of them, is really getting better alignment of procurement process with the interconnection process and transmission planning process and so forth. So, this is something that we're going to be really hoping, and we've been working with the load serving entities and encouraging them to participate, and we've gotten commitments from a number of them that they will, and within the working group. So, you know, this is something that's one of the components that I'll be going over, kind of hones in on this as one of the potential solutions. But how this will all play out in the long run will be up to working groups to decide.
Thanks, Bob. So you think there's still a carve out possible using this principle for cluster 14, or would that be a possibility in the working groups, or are we going to strictly limit this to cluster 15 and beyond?
Well, I don't think we're taking anything off the table. While track 2 is really designed to focus on how we are going to, you know, develop these transformational changes to the overall interconnection process through the Git app. If there are some good solutions to help us to do things kind of going back into cluster 14 and earlier related to procurement, you know, we ought to discuss them.
Great, thank you. Appreciate that.
All right, thank you. We do have a few more hands up. I think for the sake of time, please just remember to try to keep your questions brief, and we'll try to get to all of them before our kind of limit here. So next up, we have Jerry Melcher with Public Advocate's Office.
Hi, Jerry Melcher with Public Advocate Office. I'll keep my comments to just a couple items. First item, I noticed last week you released something to the stakeholders, said, oh, here's this thing, and oh, next week we're going to have a meeting, and then you got to supply comments on this discussion paper in a week. It doesn't work for us. It just, you know, we work on a principle typically of, you know, the commission review processes, which dictate 20 days. We've lived with 2 weeks, but 1 week is just impossible. So it's a real point of contention, I think, for our group, because, you know, even now we got summer, we got managers going on vacation. I got to go through 4 levels of review to get you anything. And, you know, it's just not really supportive of a true stakeholder process. If you can't give me 2 weeks, then I'm just, you know, stuck. I can't respond. So it's not the first time you guys have pulled this, you know, 1 week stuff, but I think all the stakeholders need at least 2 weeks, if not a minimum of 20 days. And all the processes, I don't care about your timelines. It's just really irksome to people who have to try to get you comments in a reasonable amount of time, and 1 week just isn't going to happen. The second thing is yeah, I think I agree with a lot of people that your primary stakeholder in this process is the LSEs. They are being mandated to do something, and that's where the view has to take place from. And so they're not participating in your MOUs, but they're the stuckee that have to get these resources, you know, through the mandates and authorizations online. So we need to, I think, recast this whole process to the view of open access, non-discriminatory, and LSEs taking primary role. So thank you for that.
So Jerry, I can maybe address your first comment. You know, I appreciate your feedback. We can sympathize with the fact that there is a lot going on. There's a lot of summer readiness activities, and I know stakeholders are stretched. This particular 1 week deadline isn't really what I would call a firm deadline. We're just looking for comments, you know, to sort of help guide the working groups, right? So there's going to be lots of opportunity and a lot more time through the working groups to provide comments and participate in the discussion. So this deadline, I think, is just, we're just kind of soliciting some feedback on the principles. We want to make sure that we're starting out with the right guardrails, if you will. So hopefully that helps from that perspective. The second item, I'll refer to Bob or others if you have a comment.
This is Bob. Related again to the load serving entities, we are fully anticipating their very robust involvement in this process. So we are aware of that too. So it's not like it's something that has escaped us, and it's made its way into one of the foundational principles.
Does that address your questions, Jerry?
I think he might have moved his hand down, so
Okay.
Feel free to raise your hand again if it didn't answer your question. And then we do have a question from Mark Smith with Calpine. Go ahead.
Hey folks, thanks. Good afternoon. A couple of observations, I guess, on the very first bullet point where we say you're going to prioritize in zones, and Susan's already brought up that the zones aren't very well defined yet, but where capacity exists or new transmission has been approved, I think you have a little bit of a temporal issue that we can talk through in workshops. You know, a lot of the transmission that you've recently approved isn't going to be around for 10 years. And so, you know, the question arises, are you going to allow interconnection requests that are in future zones of excess capacity to be accepted? I guess there's a temporal issue we'll have to talk through. The second thing, and probably the more related to a
Like Mark's audio dropped out. Mark, are you still there?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now. Well, go ahead. We can hear you.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Thank you. The second issue is related to the second point. The further you limit the number of resources that are eligible to compete for PPAs, the more you're going to create a position of market concentration for those resources. So you may have to have a principle that balances the limitation of your acceptance of interconnection requests with the creation of market power for the resources that you have allowed to win. I think that's probably a principle that needs to be considered as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Those are helpful.
Okay, and then we have Jason Bierwin with GridStore.
I think the comment is on the principles here. I'd like to offer that something we observe from the paper is there's, I think, a principle that could be outlined regarding, you could alternatively say how risk is shared in this process on an equitable or more equitable basis. Alternatively, we can talk about how to create a process that results in higher certainty for all parties in that process. Just the note there being that I think there's a lot of work done to try and increase the certainty around things like project viability and the interconnection customers. It's not clear that the way this is currently being discussed, though, that there's any consideration of, on the flip side, what comes back in terms of certainty regarding process, upgrades, et cetera. And so it's easy to solve this problem by pouring a lot of the risk onto a single entity in this process. I think it's worth considering whether it rises to the level of a principle that that may not be an efficient way to solve the problem. Thank you.
Good feedback.
All right, and then real quick, I see Linda Wright, your hand is up. I don't know if you had a question.
My hand is not up.
Okay, just wanted to make sure. And then Susan Schneider with Phoenix Consulting. Go ahead.
Hi. Hi, just a couple of quick ones. First, I was going to wait till the end to complain about the 1 week timeline, but I wanted to add my my voice to Jerry's. I'm representing LSA and others here, and 1 week, even if all you're doing is trying to get feedback on what were some very, very detailed positions and proposals, especially on your concept one, if you want anything useful to be able to use in the working groups, then it seems like you need to at least give people a chance to think about it and to respond. So even if you had to, I don't want to get into this, but even if you had to delay the workshops for a week or something, if you really want people to give you thoughtful feedback, which we would very much like to provide, that additional week is really important. So I wanted to add my voice to that. And then the other question I had, though, and this came up also with respect to your responses to Jerry, was I guess I was under the assumption that your second, and maybe I should wait till you get there, but your second element with talking about managing the queue, that was something that would apply to the existing queue and then new projects also coming into the queue. Was it your intent that those proposals would apply only going forward to new projects coming in, starting with cluster 15, and they would not apply to any earlier projects? Or can you just clarify that point, please?
This is Jason. I think relative to the managing the queue section, it sort of depends on the proposal and the topic specifically being discussed and considered, and how we would handle it, one, going forward, but handle it with existing projects in the queue as well, right? And I'll sort of leave it to Bob to discuss the study process and interconnection items.
Well, I guess, for example, the process, the restrictions on, the proposed restrictions on MMA requests or on transferring deliverability, is it your intent that those would apply to projects in the queue? I mean, I had sort of assumed it was, but are you assuming, did you intend that those would only apply to projects, starting with cluster 15?
Oh, yeah, no, so respective to modification requests or deliverability transfers, it would be any transaction that occurs after the approval of policy once okay. We get that approval for FERC. Yep.
Okay, so things like notice to proceed, all those other things that are in there, those are, your intent was to apply those things to the existing queue and not
Correct.
Only starting with cluster 15. Okay, that's what I thought, but I just wanted to verify that based on your earlier responses. So I really appreciate that clarification. Thank you.
Yeah, Susan, this is Joanne. Just to address your first question, in terms of the 1 week comment period, if it is definitely a concern for folks, we can take a look at what it would take in terms of moving the working group schedule around to accommodate another week. We just didn't necessarily think it was that critical given what the working groups are going to be doing, but we really do want to make sure that you are able to provide really good, valuable feedback. So we will take that into consideration.
Really appreciate it.
All right. We do have a comment from Kathleen Colbert on the line. Go ahead.
Thank you. This is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. I have another request for consideration on principles in response to Jeremy Melker's comments. It kind of got me thinking a bit more. And one thing that I would note is that, it's really important that there be fair representation of all market participants in these stakeholder processes. And I know that the CAISO is committed to that. I'm not asking you to add that. But that it's important that we all recognize that there's multiple different stakeholders that are impacted by these types of reforms. Not only the load-serving entities that are the off-takers and sometimes developers, but especially the developers and interconnection customers that have to go through this process. So while the LSCs are very important and they are our partner in the process that we go through to develop new resources, and we work very productively and collaboratively with them to provide those services. So I just wanted to know that it's really critical that we don't preference one stakeholder or one part of the industry over others as we go through this process. I know the CAISO believes in that, but I would like to ask if we could add to your in addition, the reforms must not only ensure open access, but they also need to not be unduly discriminatory or preferential. And it might be helpful just to note that in the next iteration of the document so that there's a level setting across the stakeholder membership.
Yeah, Kathleen, I think that's just a really, really good grounding principle, you know, overall, right? Just in general, not just related to this initiative, and we would definitely agree with you there. So.
Yeah, no, I know. It's always nice to write things down sometimes, especially it was comforting to see, you know, that the principles, the way that they were laid out is really productive. So appreciate your consideration. I would just, as far as like moving the working group meetings, I would note that that's like 2 weeks from now. And if that decision is going to be made, if you could make it in the next day or two, that would be incredibly helpful. Thank you.
Yep, understood. Thank you.
Right, and then I think we have our last question here. Shane O'Brien, go ahead.
And you're unmuted. You may go ahead.
Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. I think someone brought this up earlier, and I don't want to belabor the point, but I do feel like there's somewhat of a critical element that's missing, both from these principles here and on the problem identification on the next slide. And I see how what's on here is very intertwined with what the problem's been identified as, but I think a lot of us are struggling that there isn't what's being done with what's happening in the middle, right? So you guys are trying to focus on limiting or constraining what's coming into the process and trying to deal with like all the stuff that went through the process but isn't proceeding the way the process had intended it to. And you know, it's just kind of surprising because the last IAP before the preceded cluster 14 took a look at how the actual study process and like the intro queue process was actually done and looked at ways of making that process more efficient. And I think the timing piece is a really critical component here. It was brought up somewhat anecdotally through some of the other comments that were made here. This, you know, chasm between the TPP and the transmission and service dates. There's this huge chasm between the interconnection process, when you go into it, how long it takes, when you get out of it, when your commercial operation date could even possibly be after that. I mean, you know, right now I think the shortest time frame anyone's looking at is somewhere between 6 and 7 years, which isn't great and doesn't seem to align with anyone's procurement or any of the commission's plans for, you know, the generated transitions. And so again, I would really ask you guys to reconsider bringing in some sort of mid-process component to this discussion, and having the timing and performance be a principle of the reform, as it seems to be a very common and huge barrier for really all entities involved in this process. Thank you.
Thanks, Shane. We hear the concern, and we'll definitely see how we can talk about it and work through it.
All right, well, thank you everyone for all your questions. I did get some brief comments in the chat. One from Gary Holdsworth from SCG&E, just saying he's glad to see the inclusion of LSC procurement in the process. And I think that's it. So we can go ahead and move on unless there's any last comments from you, Danielle.
No, I think let's jump into the problem statements and some of the concepts that we're exploring. So I turn it to.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, you know, I think this is just really good discussion, right? And that it's important for us to sort of all land or get grounded on the core principles. So it sounds like in the next round we'll need to sort of go back and make sure we all agree we've captured the right principles. So this is really, really good discussion.
All right, so we'll move to the next slide, and I believe, Bob, you're gonna take over from here.
Sure. Hopefully everybody's read the paper and have taken a pretty hard look at our problem statements. We are definitely looking at getting feedback from stakeholders on the problem statements that we've developed. There's one for intake of new interconnection requests. That's an area that I'll be covering within this discussion today. And another problem statement for managing of outstanding interconnection requests that Jason will be handling. And so we want to have some discussion around those today. We'd like to get some some feedback from everybody in their written comments on these, so that we'd like to be able to be ready to jump into the working group discussions and pretty quickly be able to come to an agreement and consensus on the problem statements that we would all agree to within the working groups. So this is one area that we are looking for more specific comments on, but I think it's pretty concentrated in these problem statements. So I think the development of comments hopefully is a good enough time for that. Just to comment a little bit about the 1 week period. Unfortunately, it might have been worthwhile to actually put out what the comments template looks like now, so that people get a better understanding. We're not necessarily looking for full-blown comments on all of the various concepts that we're proposing. We're looking to get very high-level comments. We're hoping that the type of comments that we're seeking can be done within a week. As Susan, you mentioned, for concept 1, you could get into some pretty deep comments on that. We're not looking for that level of comments within this round of comments. We're looking for people to bring those types of comments to the working group meetings themselves. So what we're actually asking for within the various concepts are pretty high level thoughts about them. Do you agree with them, or do you oppose them, or is there some key issues that you think need to definitely be make sure that are addressed within those various concepts. So we're hoping that the type of comments that we're looking for are something that can be developed within a week. So let's go on to the next slide. Could we move to the next slide, please?
Michelle, are you able to advance to, there we go.
There we go.
Just a second, my computer first.
Okay, no problem. Thank you. I'd like to just take a minute and allow everybody to read through this. This is something that, eventually we'll be doing some wordsmithing on as a group. But just like the principles that we just discussed, we'd like to get some high-level discussion on this as well. So let's just take a minute and I'll allow everybody to read through this, and we'll open it up for some discussion. So this is obviously the ISO's perspective of the problem. One of the things that we kind of considered within the comments matrix is, should we ask for people to provide a problem statement based on their individual perspective? And while we didn't necessarily go down that path, we want you to think about this problem statement from your individual perspective and see if there's something in this that should be tweaked a bit, should be added to it, something missing. So why don't we just open it up for a discussion around this?
All right, I see we have a hand raised from Susan Schneider with Phoenix Consulting. Go ahead.
Hey, Bob, I wanted to just address what you had said earlier about the fact that you're looking for high-level comments. There are a lot of details. It's kind of weirdly detailed for this level. especially on concept 1 in the proposal. And also, going into things like financial security postings and what you would get if you withdraw or you don't withdraw at a different time. I mean, there's a lot of that kind of thing in there. So I think that we were thinking that you were looking for actual comments on those things. But I guess the thing that one of the things I can tell you right now that probably will show up in our comments and maybe others is sometimes there are some things there in getting into all those details that are there. There are things that where we can't really understand necessarily what the problem was. For example, the limitations on deliverability transfers. The CAISO, one of the great improvements you've made is to loosen that up, and we've advocated more of that. And yet there's in there limitations. So what are the problems that you're trying to solve for some of these things? What are the problems that you're trying to solve with other proposals here? Some of it we can't, I mean, we understand there's too many interconnection requests, so I'm going to address in a minute. But for some of these other things where you're trying to, the timing of MMA requests or things like what are you, is construction sequencing when people tell you they want to do that, is that really a problem? And so we're lacking in some ways, in some of these proposals, we're just lacking the foundations that for information that needs to come from the CAISO on why are you proposing this exactly? Is it an issue? And if it is, why is it, so we can understand? So I will tell you that is one area where we want to I can give you comment right now, but we'll definitely be putting in our comments to understand why these things are there. Some of them are obvious, some of them are not so obvious.
Well, if we could kind of stick to the 2 problem statements we've got now, and sounds like you're addressing some of the some comments on problem statement number 2. So we wholeheartedly agree. We need to have a firm foundation of a problem statement that everybody agrees to. That is our basis for how we move forward to find solutions to that problem. So yeah, I agree. If you find that you think that our problem statements are lacking in some area, please give us comments either now and in your written comments. So related to what's before you now, do you have any comments on this?
Yeah, I do, but I'm just saying, I think that the CAISO, before the working groups start, so that's why I'm giving this feedback now, is there are things like deliverability transfers and construction sequencing and other areas where you have a proposal, but there's not a foundation. And we need that to talk about that in the working groups. So, and this is just data. It's not this particular problem statement. It's data that needs to come from the CAISO so we can understand what the specific things are that you have in there. So now let me talk about this particular proposal or this particular problem statement. It's not clear, and it's hard to know what would have happened if something had happened other than what happened, but at least part, and I'm speaking anecdotally here, at least part of the problem here, the reason you got so many more interconnection requests with massive amounts of capacity is the idea that it was very clear that telescoping that cluster 16 was somewhere out in the ether, and what may or may not, who knows when that might happen, maybe not till you need more in the queue, which could be years from now. And so I think that the uncertainty around cluster 16 in part was partly responsible for why you were completely snowed here in cluster 15, because people upsized their, whatever the interconnection requests they were proposing to submit, they upsized them, they put in more than they thought they would need because they didn't know when they would be able to do it again. I don't know how you get around that problem, to be honest, but I'm not, and maybe it would have been just as bad anyway. I really, I can't say, I really don't know, but I sense that some of what you got snowed with here was because of the uncertainty of what was going to come later. So I don't know how that helps you here exactly, but I just felt like maybe it's something that should have been said.
And I will have to admit that I think you are correct. To what extent, we don't know. I don't know that we can know. But we do know that in an informal survey that we did, we anticipated getting 300 projects. And, granted that not everybody answered that survey, probably would have been somewhat more than 300, but, we don't know how much. But bottom line from the ISO's perspective, if it was only 300, that's in the range of another super cluster. And so, even without us, understanding how people put in projects, knowing that cluster 16 was going to be delayed as well. I think we still have enough projects coming into the queue each window now that it's no longer an efficient process, and the accuracy of the studies is being compromised with so many projects. So from our perspective, at least from the ISO's perspective, we need to figure out how to deal with that particular issue.
Right. And I agree. I mean, I'm not saying that 300 projects wouldn't have been terrible, but it probably wouldn't have been, maybe not 500 projects and maybe not 300 and whatever megawatts you got. So I'm not saying that this isn't a problem. And as you layer on projects and assume everything before it is built, which obviously is not going to happen, obviously there was a problem there. But I think just the magnitude of it possibly was because of the circumstance. I think your survey was done before it became very. It was suspected that cluster 16 might be an issue, but it was really clear by the time the window opened that what was going to be happening with cluster 16 or not. So anyway, as I said, I'm not sure that changes your definition of the problem here. I just felt like the magnitude of it, though, perhaps would have been somewhat less. I'm done.
All right, thank you. And then we have Ryan Quadro on the line. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much. I'll make this quick. I just wanted to make another plug for efficiency here based on the problem statement. I think limiting intake is one thing, but also reviewing exactly how much data the CAISO is going to process and how detailed those studies are going to be can be a huge input into making this process more refined and more efficient. So again, hoping we'll push efficiency into those driving principles. And to sort of support Brian's sentiment earlier, perhaps add to the problem identification some element of the study process that in the middle part that takes so long and really is the bulk of the work for both the ISO and the PTOs. Reducing throughput doesn't just mean reducing the number of interconnections, but also means refining the process down to essentials. So thank you so much.
All right, thank you.
Alan Combs with New Consulting, go ahead.
Hi, this is Alan Combs with New Consulting. I just want to convey that more requests means more competition, more, I've been behind a lot of requests and each one of them presents an opportunity worth pursuing. Otherwise the request wouldn't be made. You're not making the case that you're losing money on processing these requests. I get the part about being overwhelmed. I think the solution has to do with providing a preliminary plan of service, feasibility like study initially, and then allowing you to kind of park until such time as you can win the merits of a deliverability allocation. So that'll be part of our proposal. But the idea that just somehow the volume itself is the problem, I just take it off. Obviously it was unmanageable, and yes, you created your own problem in cluster 15 by indicating it was like the last cluster for all time, but there's going to be a lot of opportunities in cluster 14. There are a lot of opportunities in cluster 13 that only got deliverability in the last few weeks, right? So it's really about managing plan of service studies versus deliverability allocations in my mind. That's it.
Okay. Well, Ellen, I appreciate your comments. Sounds like you're ready to jump into the work groups and start talking about solutions, which is great. But if you actually have comments related to the problem statement itself, that's what we're looking for, both now and for within your written comments.
All right, thank you.
All right, next we have Allison Althill with Southern California Edison. Go ahead.
Allison, hello, this is Allison Althill with Southern California Edison.
I just wanted to reiterate some of, I think, what I heard around the volume of interconnections. And I've heard it elsewhere, but I actually don't see it in here, which is around how do we make the study process meaningful for generators? Yes, the volumes have been difficult to work through, but I think the bigger challenge that we face is the number of megawatts and projects leads to a lot of upgrades and a lot of uncertainty amongst generators, whether those upgrades are going to be needed and when, which kind of lends more uncertainty overall in the process. So I think one thing that we'd like to see here is focusing on making it meaningful for all parties, whether procurement, the generators, and for the PTOs.
So if you could, in your comments, work that into how you would adjust our problem statement related to that, or possibly put in a principle related to that, that would be helpful.
Certainly, will do.
Okay, Gary Holdsworth with San Diego Gas and Electric, go ahead and open your line.
All right, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, great, great, thanks. So I'm riffing on what Susan was mentioning, as well as what I see in front of me here. The words that are key, I think, to this statement are now needed by the state on a sustained basis. So therein lies the rub. We have a known need that's been communicated by the state agencies, and the market that is the market it is providing, multiples of that need. So we have a scarcity problem that has, to my, from what I'm seeing, is you're talking about a way to reduce the number or megawatts or, location and things like that. Q, lack of a better term, Q rationing. So I think the point is correct that, saying it's a problem. We have the market outstripping the availability or the capacity or the need. Now, we could all sit and, Susan was talking about why, and I also think that there is a why behind the, recent big move up in the number of requests, and that's frankly a lot of, hot money chasing deals, and you cannot do anything about that. It's a market response as well. That hot money could easily go away, but it hasn't yet. So until it goes away, you're going to be in this situation, and that sustained basis is what had me thinking about that. Is that over time, perhaps it could get more rational, the market. But right now, the market is irrational. The market is putting in way too much than what we need. And so I think you're right in the right direction on this problem statement, but it's more about what is needed versus what is the market is providing. Thank you.
Well, again, thanks, Gary, and you can give us your thoughts of how to weave that into the problem statement. We'd appreciate it.
All right, Doug Karpa with Peninsula Clean Energy, go ahead.
Doug, your line is unmuted.
Sorry.
You may go ahead.
Yes, Doug Karpa, Peninsula Clean Energy. I think I have additional language here. I mean, I guess the point about efficiency is a good one, I think, in the sense that, like, at the end of the day, we need, however many gigawatts of things being built each year. So that, I think that's right, that sets kind of the target. And I'm just wondering if there's a sense of refining this. Of course, one way to increase the throughput is to make things more efficient, right? Like fewer resources, fewer applications getting processed makes those easier and faster to study. And then, of course, if the study itself is simplified in some way, that's also useful, which I understand will take up in the deliverability proceeding to some degree. But the other part of it is I'm wondering whether we should be considering also designing a system that can accommodate more capacity for CAISO. And I've, chatted informally with you all about the question of can we just hire more engineers and pay everybody more so that they stay to get this problem done? And my understanding is, well, this is not a throw money at the problem kind of problem. But I'm wondering if there's some way to emphasize that this is a matter of both increasing efficiency and also probably increasing capacity in some way, and whether there's a design that would make it easier for more people being involved might increase the throughput. Sorry for that being a little inchoate, but and I'll try to put that in comments as well. But I'm just wondering about the not to put too fine a point on it, hire more engineers angle of this, and whether there's anything worth thinking about there.
Right. Thank you.
And then we have Kathleen Colbert on the line. Go ahead.
Thank you. This is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. I guess I wanted to unpack a little bit of a process question. So helpful conversations about the problem statements. And I guess my working assumption going into these working group meetings is that the purpose of both the 20th and the 21st is to really dig into the problem statements, these two, and what's potentially missing. Because I honestly think you didn't explicitly call out the resource as a third problem statement, like the resource constraints, which I know is a function of the magnitude of requests. But it might be reasonable to call it out as its own problem statement. There's more workload coming in than can be processed, and so other resources, external and increased costs to process those is a problem statement, right? But so I thought Doug's point was valid and that that's a problem. My understanding is that's what we're going to be teasing into these. So the feedback, that opportunity to really talk about these problems will be then. And then at a later meeting, we will get into solutions. Can you confirm that understanding?
I'll take that question.
Okay, go ahead, Joanne.
Take that question, Bob. Yes, so Kathleen, you're absolutely right, and that's why we started this process off with a discussion paper, because we don't want to assume that we have defined all of the problem statements, right? So I think our first course of action here is to make sure we all land on the right principles, and then the working groups are going to dig into the problem statements. And like I said, we may not have all of the problems defined, so those should come out, in the working groups. So your point is well taken. Hopefully that helps clarify. And then in terms of getting into solution space, once we agree on the problem statements and we want to start moving into solution space, we're going to be looking for stakeholders to present proposals on how to solve those problems. I think you're familiar with some of the working groups that we did for other policy initiatives, and so we will follow that sort of same similar concept.
Joanne, for clarifying, super helpful. Yep, thank you.
And so just to add a bit of my perspective, it depends on what kind of comments we get, and if we think we can get to a problem statement, sooner than later. If we are able to come to a consensus on it quickly, then it's possible we could actually get into discussion of solutions within, that first 2 days. So time will tell. And we also want to talk about the principles. So it's just a matter of how fast we can come to consensus on those items before we get to solutions. So maybe being an optimist, I was hoping we might get into some solutions within those first few days, but again, time will tell. And And, you know, as Joanne said, we definitely want to nail down the principles and the problem statement before we start into solutions. So that's, you know, a very foundational, important component of this overall process.
All right, we have a question from Mark Smith with Calpine. Go ahead.
Problem statement. This goes specifically to the problem statement, Bob. And, you know, it says that the current process cannot efficiently accommodate all applicants and must substantially be redesigned to meet state policy and reliability needs. You know, a contrarian in me, it says that cluster 14 and prior is plenty to meet state policy and reliability needs. So we may want to try to figure out how that can be revised to indicate the real problem, which is simply the fact that there's too many applications for you to process. Isn't that right?
I see that as kind of a double-pronged issue. Is one, there's too many to process in a timely fashion. We could always develop a process to handle 550 interconnection requests, but no one would like the timeline related to that. The other portion of that is when you have so much capacity across the system in a single cluster that you're studying, each study area is going to have so much capacity that the results are not going to be as accurate and useful as everybody would like to see. So it's not only just, you know, if we could have infinite number of engineers and servers and everything we need to do the studies still are going to be based on so much capacity in each area that the results aren't going to be, you know, really the type of results we're looking for. There's going to be so many upgrades required to accommodate this capacity that it becomes somewhat irrelevant to what is really going to be needed to bring the right amount of capacity and to meet our needs. So I just wanted to make that clear as well. It's not just people, it's also just the accuracy of the process that becomes
I
key
think
issue.
actually, Bob, that's probably even a better problem statement than what's written here. You know, to suggest that, you know, by processing them all and evaluating all of the requests, you're building a house of cards with enormous transmission upgrade requirements that may be economically inefficient to meet the state policy goals. I mean, I think that's a better problem statement, because cluster 15 isn't needed, I don't think, at all to meet the state policy goals. Okay, thanks, but I'll put that in comments.
Okay, appreciate that.
Yeah, thanks for that, Mark.
All right. Well, Mark, do you have a follow-up question? I see your hand. There we go. All right. I think that's all we have for questions at this time, Bob. I'll hand it back to you.
Okay, let's move to the next slide.
Bob, I think maybe what we can do is, based on how the conversation's going, maybe just kind of summarize the problem statements that we have identified so that we can sort of get some grounding around the problem statements.
So are you suggesting skip the next 3 slides?
Yeah, and go to the next problem statement. I think we've got good feedback on this one.
Okay, well, let me just go through those very quickly. Just for awareness.
Okay, just go through them and then we'll get to the next problem statement. That's fine.
Yeah, and you know, let's go into, okay, thank you. So the idea of presenting these next 3 slides, which are, you know, the concepts for dealing with the issue of interconnection request intake. These were items that originally we were considering doing as a straw proposal, but then when we pulled back and decided to move into, we were always planning a working group process, but we decided to make this more the way it's been done in recent other stakeholder processes, so that seemed to work really well. We decided to make this into more of a discussion paper, but we didn't want to just throw these ideas out. We think these ideas are something that are worth discussing in the working groups. along with proposals that stakeholders bring forward. So I just wanted to just kind of bring these up just at a very high level and couch them in a way of saying, these are some ideas that we have. We think some of these ideas, you know, some of them, we have different levels of depth of what we've gone into these various ideas. But, you know, as Susan, we're not looking for comments on, you know, say concept one. You could write pages of comments on this, I realize that, but we're not looking for that. We're looking for that kind of level of discussion really within the working group. So, you know, let me just go through these real quickly, and if there's any clarifying questions that are really important, I think we can retain a few, but we want to move through this pretty quickly so we can get to the problem statement that Jason will be going over. So this concept one is one that is most closely aligned with our current process, where we'd be looking at utilizing, and let me just back up for a second. Within all of the proposals or the concepts that we brought up, as well as what we think the stakeholders should be bringing up, one of the important concepts that we need to really deal with, or components of each of the concepts that we deal with, is a TPD allocation process. That is, you know, since we do have a certain amount, you know, I don't want to say limited, but it is a limited amount of transmission plan deliverability that we have available to give to projects. We have to really make sure that that process for allocation or giving or making a project full capacity delivery status is one of the things that is a very important component to be discussing within each concept. So this first one is related to utilizing some sort of a criteria, scoring criteria or other method to be able to take 550 projects for cluster 15 and, you know, future clusters regardless, you know, depending on how many we get, but getting those narrowed down to something more close to what we think is the right amount to study based on the amount of capacity that we have available in our system and the amount of capacity we need to procure. So we thought of this, could it be done in one step? Possibly. I'm a little concerned that it's hard enough to build criteria that's going to reduce the number of projects down to the level we think is the appropriate amount. So there may need to be a two-step process on this, but so just to throw that out. And then the idea is based on those that are selected through the scoring process and those are not, we'll put those projects into two different groups. Group one are those that are selected that do have the ability to compete for the transmission plan deliverability that's available and make those projects full capacity delivery status in similar to our option A that's in our tariff right now. Group two would be projects that aren't selected or projects that aren't seeking to interconnect in the areas that we have existing capacity, where those projects could continue to move forward, but they would have to move forward as an option B project using option B criteria where they don't get reimbursement for their DNUs, they would get congestion revenue rights. So that's concept one. Why don't we move down to concept two, the next slide. So there's been some discussion already around load serving entity involvement in this process. We see load serving entities as well as other off-takers as a very key component of this overall process. And so one of the ideas that we wanted to bring forward is, well, how can we put them more in the driver's seat of this process? And so this option or concept that's here is that we would actually be studying projects that the off-takers, the load-serving entities, would provide to us. That they would perform some form of an initial screen of projects based on available information, knowing that at this point in time, they don't have the costs for interconnection, but based off of the costs that are, or information and cost that is available at this point in time, they would give us a slate of projects that they would say, here are the ones that we're most interested in. And you know, that could be a letter of interest or something, you know, not looking for, you know, shortlisting or anything like that at this point, but something that would demonstrate an interest to say, these are the projects we want you to study. And it could be something like twice the amount of capacity that they're looking to procure for that particular year. You know, that's something that would have to be worked out, you know, an earlier concept or comment was, we got to make sure that we don't just give all of our transmission capacity to a small group where they have market power when it comes to the procurement negotiation. So we're aware of that issue, and that's something that would need to be worked into this. And then once those projects go through phase one, then the low turbine entities, along with the developers, would sit down and go into the results meetings. And from that information, that the low turbine entities could give us the projects that they would want to have studied in phase two. So that's the basis for that particular concept. And then if we go to the third slide, or the next slide, that is. So this third concept is one that we have the least amount of development on, but we're wanting to throw out the option for having an auction to determine which projects would be successful for moving forward into the study process. And this is something that would, if the working group, we get enough support for this concept, we would discuss it further in the working groups to determine what that, the methodology and so forth of this process would look like. The paper does pose some questions as well as some basic framework for an auction process, but we didn't take it very far because we didn't want to prejudge what an auction would look like. We really wanted the working groups to work through that and develop that. So again, for these three areas, we're not looking for in-depth comments. We're looking for very high level comments related to, do you think this is a workable concept that should be discussed further within the work groups and that type of thing. So please don't worry about having to get into a lot of details about how you would adjust whatever these concepts look like at this point in time. So are there any clarifying questions that are really needed at this point in time before we move on to what Jason's going to discuss?
I do have a few hands up. Let's start with Susan Schneider. Go ahead.
Hi, Bob. So I think the confusion here is because there is there's pages and pages of detail on concept one, including what would happen if a project started there and then converted to energy only, and what would the first posting versus the second or third posting be, and what would the refundability of each of the postings be if you withdraw. There's a huge amount of detail in there, but it sounds like what you're saying is that you don't actually want any. Those were intended only to be things that needed to be talked about in the working groups, but you don't actually want that level. You don't want any comments on all of the detail that's in there, only on the basic idea. Is that my and I don't want to put words in your mouth. I want to make sure we really understand, because a lot of the consternation and discussion that has gone on since this paper was issued a week ago is around a lot of the detail that is in it. So are you saying that you do not actually want comments on those details at this time? You just really want, sort of at the same level, for example, as these slides are. Is that really what you're looking for at this point?
Yes, it is. Again, you could get into a lot of detail and pick apart the very points we had out there.
So that's why we're asking.
It's one of those things that once we made the transition from, a straw proposal to a discussion paper, we thought, well, we've done all this work, we've put some ideas out there. We kind of consider it a bit of a springboard to get into the working group discussions. So, this is food for thought. And if you say, okay, for example, not to put words in your mouth, but I like concept one. But there are some key components I've got some real problems with, and I've got some proposals of how to tweak that into something that I think is a workable solution. That's the kind of thing we're looking for within the work group discussion, but we're not looking for that within the comments. We understand you do only have a week, so we wanted to make it pretty high level and workable for you to be able to put together the comments in that week period of time, and not put you in a situation where you're not going to be able to provide for us what you really think is necessary within that comment period.
I still think the week is a huge challenge, just for particular people who have industry groups, but you don't want any, so for, comments on all the details that are in there on what the withdrawal penalties would be and at different stages of things. You don't want any of those comments right now.
Yeah, I'm envisioning like a, good paragraph on each one of these.
Yeah, I mean, if I could just clarify, Susan, this is Joanne Serena in the room. For this first iteration, prior to going to the first working group, we're really focused on the principles, grounding on the principles and the problem statement. So I think if stakeholder comments can be focused on those two areas, then I think we'll be in a good place for that first working group. So I think really that's, if that helps clarify. Certainly if somebody has some ideas around potential solutions, we welcome that, but I think what we're really looking for right now is alignment on the principles and the problem statements. So this is the first problem statement.
Okay, so none of the details that, I'm sorry, go ahead, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, so none of the details on that are in there, even though they're, again, that's what I think some of the confusion is because there are details in there that those were actually part of a proposal or what the CAISO is thinking right now would happen. And so, but you actually don't want, even though there's all these details in there, you don't want comments on them right now. You just want more high level things just based on problem statements and ideas here.
Correct.
Do you want comments on data that we need from the CAISO to form the basis of the working group discussions? Would that be helpful?
Yeah, actually that would be very helpful, yes. So we would welcome that. And just so you know where we're coming from, right? To Bob's point, this initiative was a little bit further along than, let's say, just a blank whiteboard, right? And so we didn't want to necessarily throw the baby out with the bathwater here, right? We have material that we've put together. We want to leverage it, but we're also wanting to be very flexible and open because I think we're in a good place to say, let's just double check, right? We've got the right principles and the right problem statement.
Okay, and the right the basis of information that would be needed. So okay, so I still think a week is not reasonable in general, just in terms of communication that people have to make within their own constituencies.
Yeah, and that's understood, and we will take that back to see if we want to adjust the timeline a little bit to give a little bit more space for that. But like I said, we didn't necessarily think that the working group is going to be a lot of this kind of discussion, right? So the comments aren't necessarily needed as final going into like an issue paper, right?
Okay, so are you going to be putting out a template for the comments?
Yes.
Okay, and let me ask you sort of I guess I could probably leave this till the end, but in terms of the working groups, are they going to be conducted at the same times, or can you participate in two different working groups because they aren't going to be held the meetings aren't held at the same time? It's not really clear from the schedule.
So we're not going to be
running. We will
have
working groups.
Yeah, go ahead, Bob.
Where everybody can participate in all of them.
Yeah.
We don't want to limit anybody by having to choose. Well, we got these concurrent meetings going on, and you got to pick one. We want everybody to be able to participate in all of that they want to.
Okay, so they're not going to be like both working groups at the same time.
No.
Right.
No.
Okay. Okay, correct. And is participation going to be allowed remotely, or do you have to actually physically be there?
Remote participation is going to be allowed for sure.
Okay, great, thanks. And sorry, I probably should have left that till the end, but I appreciate it. Okay, well, I appreciate that clarification. It wasn't clear because there was so much detail in the paper that you didn't actually want comments on it. So, okay, well, I'll take that back.
Understood.
Thank you very much for that clarification.
Okay.
All right, we have Ryan Millard with Next Era Energy Resources. Go ahead.
Hey, Ryan Millard, Next Era Energy. I really appreciate the clarification. I think the template will also help as well as in terms of limiting the viewpoints. These concepts but just to clarify, these concepts that you introduce are not intended to limit the potential reforms that you're open to exploring as it relates to managing interconnection requests is the feedback I'm getting. So if we see something missing here or problems with some of these concepts, we'll still be able to explore it in working groups. If we have some reform ideas that don't necessarily relate to just these concepts, there's still opportunity to identify those concepts as part of the working groups. Is my understanding correct?
Yes, that's correct. You know, the main thing that we are looking for is that whatever proposals that stakeholders bring forward, that they do adhere for the most part to the principles that we're developing. That's why the principles are so important.
Perfect. Thank you for the clarification.
Susan, do you have a quick clarifying question? I see your hand is still raised. Maybe we can open up her line. Okay, she put her hand down. Let's move on to Alan Combs with New Consulting.
Yeah, hi, thank you. So I think my comment is on the problem statement, and I realize, and this is a problem I've had probably since I was a student, is that I read the statement but not the title. And so really there's a problem with even the title of the problem. I mean, it's much more. Problem one is much more than just intake. It's really your deliverability allocation process. And maybe that's obvious to you, but I really think you need to reframe the actual problem statement. Because you're really proposing a method by which, again, projects would be studied and deliverability allocation would be managed. And it is a multi-year process. I mean, literally only in the last week, again, I think these examples are relevant. We have a project that entered the queue in 2018 or 2019. It only recently got a change that all of a sudden makes this project much more feasible, and it had nothing to do with, I know it's really easy to pick on the generators by, multiple modifications and a burdened queue, but this just had to do with a change in reliability standards. So it didn't have anything to do with the generator. But all of a sudden the project's viable and it might move forward, right? So it's a multi-year process you're looking at. It's much, much more than intake, and it has and it's a management process separate from what you're calling queue management, which is really some business processes. So I just want to put that out there. And the other thing, I support the idea that these work groups are going to support stakeholder proposals. So I think that's been made clear with the last comment from Ryan, which is good, but I hope you'll give stakeholders an opportunity to make their own presentations on a solution. I mean, obviously we'll, make them adjacent to the 3 that you've put out, but I don't think you should be limited. And to the underlying principle that this has to be done in the time frame of getting completed in this year, I would just say, I'm not sure that's the highest goal. I mean, you did have it as a priority, but I think you need to put forward the idea that maybe this will take longer because nobody has solved this, across the United States. If you're really going to solve it, I think you have to be willing to take the time to actually introduce ideas. And for one example, Susan has mentioned you need more information, but another one is if you're really serious about auction, you're gonna have to get some economists on and present auction design. So if that was anything more than just throwing a bone to a board member who likes auctions, then you've got to actually get some resources to study that one, right? So both taking the time to do the stakeholder process is right, and I don't think you should necessarily be driven by a December deadline, which is, I think, what's translating the kind of ridiculous request that we have to comment in a week. So with that, I'll stop.
Okay, so Alan, definitely would love to see your proposal for a problem statement. I think, you can probably throw out the title of that, within a paper, you're going to have to title something, but that's really, you just can't put enough information in the title to make it really workable. So we're really just looking for the problem statement. As far as timeline goes, there's kind of a tension that we're concerned about being able to put forth enough projects, even though we've got a lot of projects in the queue as well, we want to get project studies so they can proceed to getting their PPAs and moving forward. So, that's a reliability side, but it's also a side for developers. So if you as a developer feel that you know, oh, granted, I want to get my projects online and get them studied as quickly as possible, but we need to take the time now. I'd sure love to see that in your comments. And anybody else that has thoughts around that as well, that, you know, as important as cluster 15 is to me, I think it's appropriate to take the time to get this right. So let's do that. So, you know, please put those kind of comments to us. And the comment template is out there, and we are asking for comments or proposals from stakeholders. And yes, you would be able to actually present your proposal. It wouldn't be the ISO presenting something for you. So we're very committed to hearing what you think is a solution from your perspective.
Alan, this is Joanne Serena from the room. Yeah, I would just add, you know, your points are well taken. We are proposing there's some significant reform that needs to take place, right? And I think everybody would agree with that. And if we want to do this right, maybe it will take longer. I don't know. I don't think we know the answer to that. But I think the commitment here is that we want a solution that's going to be sustainable, viable, and it's going to work. And so we have to be willing to change, and we'll have to see where that takes us in terms of a timeline. But to Bob's point, we also have to balance, you know, operating at the same time. We're sort of changing the airplane while flying it, kind of a concept. So we have to be cognizant of that. But your point is absolutely well taken.
I think I got unmuted. I'll suggest that maybe there's almost three problems. There's one of, and you already have a title for it. It's called, it was a bit of a mouthful, but it's generation, interconnection, and deliverability allocation. In fact, you named the whole tariff that. So that's the process. The second one might be managing you know, the restudy and queue management process in the context of financial incentives to downsize or exit. And the third one is some of these business management solutions, which honestly, you know, that, I mean, I'll tell you what, I won't raise my hand for that one, but I think there's a false equivalency here that the stuff that you're calling problem 2 even compares at all to problem 1. I mean, you could probably outsource a lot of the things that are in your problem 2, which is queue management issues. You know, if you have a valid study and you have criteria for modification, you can facilitate that. Everything else is really about how much deliverability you're consuming and what's your cost of interconnection. So anyway, I'll stop.
Great, thank you. Let's go ahead and move on to Kathleen Colbert.
Hold on one second, Kathleen. All right, Kathleen, you're good. I'm sorry. I accidentally lowered your hand. Go ahead.
Oh, no worries at all. Thanks for finding me. This is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. Helpful back and forth. I want to share what I'm struggling with as I'm trying to figure out how to engage as far as next steps, is that I definitely have feedback that we could provide on all of these concepts. They are detailed. I think on first blush, concept 3 is the only workable one. Concept 1 and concept 2 don't seem workable, but we'd have to get into all the details and have a very robust discussion of it, which I envision taking a lot of time. And I want to be open to the fact that we haven't gone through the problem statement and really sharing experiences and challenges. So maybe my gut reactions to your discussion paper aren't giving a fair amount of thought on it without input from other stakeholders. So that's one thing I'm struggling with, is I do want to come to the working group meetings and I want to learn from my peers their challenges, their view of these challenges, so that I can have a better understanding, not only from that of a developer that's developing very large projects, that we believe are very viable. And we have had challenges. I know my challenges, but I want to learn from others their challenges. So I don't want to prejudge these concepts, even though I do have feedback. So I'm a little nervous about putting written comments down on this discussion, going into the working groups on the 3 concepts for those reasons, and I hope that makes some sense. I also hear you calling for proposals, and as you know, Vistra, we've been providing proposals for interconnection reform since, like, I want to say 2020, since the supercluster project. I feel like it's the first time we really put forward some actionable proposals or options, and we can package that up, but I want to be honest, not by next week, other than just to cite all of those comments, and then to have you, the team, go and review them, because we have been submitting a great deal of comments with our proposals over the last couple of years. So for a working group meeting to discuss our proposals and bring them, the ones that you have scheduled are just too soon. And so the other thing I'm struggling with is if you're asking for a robust discussion of these concepts and our proposals to consider in addition, I'm hoping there's a second round of working group meetings to have that kind of discussion. I just won't be prepared on the 20th and 21st. These are the things that are causing me to not feel prepared for that. I wanted to share them and just ask again for clarity. It's just the content up until the concept that you want feedback on. So through page 9 of the paper.
So we're asking for your comments on the principles as well as the problem statements, and just very high level on the various concepts that have been laid out. And what you just stated was the type of comments we're looking for. You said you made some, brief comments on, what you thought about 1, 2, and 3, and that's really the level that we're looking for on the concepts themselves.
Okay.
And I absolutely
do want to
agree. We have the same perspective of we want to learn from everybody, and if we're going to really solve this problem from everybody's perspective, there are some, entities such as the load-serving entities that the ISO hasn't really, doesn't have a deep level of understanding of all the issues that they deal with that we need to learn about. And so you're saying the same thing. So I absolutely agree with that.
That's super helpful, Bob. I think I can get comfortable providing like that level of high level comments. I really just don't want it to be prejudged and understand that that position may evolve as we do these working groups. So I appreciate your understanding.
Yeah, this is Joanne Strean again from the room. So I think, Kathleen, your comments are spot on, right? I think the whole idea behind these initial working groups is to just really learn from each other and really make sure we're understanding what the problems are. So I think what you just stated is perfect. And the fact that you've got proposals is fantastic. There will be time for that. Those don't have to be prepared, as early as, there's time for that in some of the later working group sessions. And we'll go over that schedule so you get a sense as to when we would be ready to start doing proposals.
That's perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Well, I think with the time that we have left, I think we need to move into the next problem statement. Otherwise, we're not going to have time for you to finish up at the end, Caitlin.
I think we just have one more, right? Let's just take Gary, and then we'll be able to move on.
All right, this will be quick. I'm assuming, you can correct me if I'm wrong, on concept 3 that's on the screen, this is being, this is the least baked proposal, at least as I see it, has had no input from FERC or discussions with FERC staff thus far, correct? Or has it?
On the first part, it is the least baked. And although we have had just the level of discussion with FERC to where they know we are considering an auction. So they are aware of that, and they've asked a few questions related to that. But this is something that, you know, Alan kind of made comments to it that, yeah, we're going to, if this is something that stakeholders all agree that this is something worth working towards to see if we can develop a workable solution through an auction. Yeah, it's going to take a lot of work. It's going to take getting some people in the room that are more expertise than you know, just a standard interconnection group and policy group has. So we're well aware of that. We've worked towards getting some people within the ISO to get involved in this, but you know, we'll probably have to go even beyond that. So granted, this, if we went down the road of working towards an auction, there's a lot of work that needs to be done, but it's not something that, you know, we're just throwing a bone to one of our board members putting this up here. We think it's something that could have a potential for being a very workable solution.
Okay, thanks.
All right, that's it for questions. So I'll hand it back to you, Bob, if you have any final comments, and then we'll move to Jason.
Yeah, why don't we just go to Jason?
All right, thank you, Bob. Can we progress to the next slide, please? And here's problem statement number 2. I would say in summary, or a few different words, following or after the study processes, a number of projects are not proceeding to commercial operation as expected. A number of these projects remain in the queue with no indication of any near-term viability or with really a clear intent to proceed to contract execution or commercial operation. Yeah, can we slide back up real quick? I just want to give everybody a moment to read that and see if there's any thoughts or comments.
All right, we'll give it a few minutes. Folks can raise their hand or put their comments in the chat, but we'll leave some time for you to read the statement.
All right, well, let's go ahead and let's cruise through the high-level concepts here for managing the queue section. So yeah, now we can progress to the next slide, please. Oh.
We do have a couple questions popping up.
Okay, yeah, let's back up then. Go ahead, Susan. Or if we can open Susan's line, please.
Yeah, sorry. Actually, yeah, I heard that you were going on to the concepts, and so we're just gonna have a comment on the concepts. So I'll get out and get back in the queue for that. Okay.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks, Susan.
We do have a comment in the chat from Mark Smith with Calpine, just on problem statement 2 as a statement of fact, not a problem. What problem does Deadwood create?
Can you make that big?
And then Mark, if you have a clarifying comment on that, feel free to raise your hand and can get you on the phone line. We do have a question from Doug Carpa with Peninsula Clean Energy. Can we unmute his line?
Yeah, hi. Doug Carpa, Peninsula Clean Energy. Yeah, actually, it's funny that I'm wrapping my head around like what the problem, like how I would phrase the problem here, but it seems to me that, you know, from the LSE perspective, that some of the I guess my kind of gut reaction to this, the idea of Deadwood, is we know that studying projects is like that's a really limited resource. You know, getting through the end of the queue, and if we've got a queue process where we have projects that are not going to turn into steel in the ground, it's like that project just took the spot of somebody else who didn't move, who could have moved forward. And we're scrambling for RA. We're scrambling to meet all the various requirements. You know, we're trying to build stuff as fast as we can. So I don't quite know how I would phrase it, but I think this notion that there are projects that are entering into the queue that then don't go all the way through to the completion tells me there's something about the process that's fundamentally broken, because it's not delivering the like 7 gigawatts of capacity or however much it is that we're going to need every single year for the next 20 years. So I do see that this suggests there's a mismatch between what the projects that are going through the process and the projects that are actually going to result in like real generation on the grid. As I say, I'm not entirely sure how to phrase it more specifically.
Yeah.
And maybe that's just like, I'm offended that this happens.
Doug, this is Jason. I think you nailed it though, right? Is we really struggle with the volume of projects that are proceeding through the queue that are not proceeding as expected based on the original timelines that the project is proposing. You know, we have ways to, we have commercial viability and timelines established, but we have ways to remove deliverability from projects, but we are limited in our ways to withdraw projects or place them in breach, and we're looking for ways to get those projects out of the way that aren't proceeding as they should be or could be, or need to be.
And I realize this is going to sound absurdly churlish, but and to a certain extent, if things like come through the process and then sit in the queue, you know, sit there forever, it really suggests they should never have been, you know, the application should never have been taken in the first place. Now I realize giant asterisks on that you can get through the queue and you don't have an off-taker. You can't control that ahead of time unless people are signing PPAs early on, which of course I'm also going to not be a fan of. So I can't have it both ways. I'm aware of that element of it, but yeah.
Yep.
Great.
Thanks, Doug.
And we did have a comment in the chat from Bo Paczynski with Diamond Generating Corporation, just a brief comment about issue of timing of when there are RFPs. But otherwise, I'm not seeing any questions at the moment. Event producer, do we have any audio only questions on the line?
We do not at this time.
All right, then I think we can move on.
Yeah, sounds good. If we can go to the next slide, please. So I'm not going to spend much time on these. I'll just hit them at a very high level. But some of the concepts that we're considering for managing the queue initially were, how do we improve the modification process, both on the material modification and the post-COD modification processes to either limit when those requests can be submitted, and then we are looking at deposit, you know, increasing deposits, increasing timelines to do those studies for various reasons, which we can get into in the working groups. How can we improve the limited operation study for the benefit of the developers of the projects, as far as getting more information sooner? And then how do we hold projects accountable? We're looking at ways to set more clear deadlines and requirements relative to notice to proceed and third postings following the phase 2 studies, and potentially establishing limitations and requirements for projects that are proceeding to commercial operation, and then, you know, as well as those same limitations or different limitations and requirements for projects that ultimately convert to energy only. And next slide, please. One of the proposals is to remove suspension rights from the GIA. Again, we're proposing limitations on TPD transfers or deliverability transfers, looking at some inverter requirements to make the SGIA consistent with the LGIA. And then we do have, and probably, well, we do have the proposal of a one-time opportunity to withdraw from the queue. The idea here would be that, or the initial thought is that this withdrawal opportunity would provide a full refund of any unused portion of the interconnection financial security postings. I think it's, and we included the details here, right? It's important to note that stakeholders will need to consider the timing of this process to align with the reassessment process. How are we going to deal with the non-refundable funds, and will that process be waived for this? And then the last bullet here is just considering how costs that how will costs flow downstream? Will the stakeholders be responsible for those costs, and versus allowing those costs to flow to the PTOs? And we can pause here for questions.
All right, we do have a question on the line from Rayanne Quadrille. Go ahead.
Hi, Jason. Thanks for this proposal. I'm looking forward to going through the details of it with you and the other stakeholders. I wanted to ask you if you would be willing to just elaborate on your thinking regarding the 7-year timelines that were mentioned in the proposal. It seems to me that, with questions that we have about who's necessarily responsible for a delay, there, sometimes kind of a finger-pointing exercise when you get down to the details on that. And with what we know about, PTO-directed delays with, the development industry just being what it is right now with labor and construction, and with construction timelines in general getting longer, which we see in the, TPP. That 7-year timeline, I think, was based in part on a quicker construction period that existed sort of, a decade or two ago. And I wonder if there was any thought to extending that 7 to 10 or starting that 7-year timeline at GIA execution or phase 2 study completion. Is 7 really the right number for a full cutoff?
Yeah, Rand, I mean, you raised a great point here. There's a lot to consider here in my mind would be, we have to sort of also bifurcate, who's responsible, and the finger pointing is the way you framed it, right, is, what is the responsibility of the developer, the project, the interconnection customer? What impacts do the PTOs have on upgrade development, and who's responsible for what, and what's causing the delay, right? We have PTO extensions today, that would be no different, so that would play into an account here. I think also, we can, maybe we take the 7 years out, maybe we look at something more like, once the study process is complete, the projects have to meet certain milestones by certain timelines following that study process, based on their study results. I don't know, again, kind of, I know we put that, we made some comments to the 7 years, and we even had some other timeline and conceptual timelines in the paper and in the concepts. We'd be open to hearing other ideas around those timelines, but I think we'd like to see them more specific and driven to the process rather than larger timelines where projects can sit in the queue for longer periods of time, again, tying up upgrades for either other projects or deliverability for other projects as well. And we want to see those projects move forward, not sit longer because other processes are taking longer as well.
Understood. Thank you for your thoughts.
Thanks, Rand.
We have a question from Susan Schneider. Go ahead.
Hi. This is another one of those data questions. So we were a little surprised to see the TP deliverability transfer limitations, given that the CAISO has just loosened those, and we have suggested that even for projects in nearby POIs or projects behind the same constraints, that might be considered. So we were a little dismayed here, and again, if the CAISO could provide some information about why it considers this to be a problem, again, it's sort of an about face when we were going the other direction. I think that would really be helpful. Same with suspension rights. Suspension rights, actually, the CAISO has already gone a long way toward defining and limiting the suspension rights and making them a request and not necessarily rights and that kind of thing. So if the CAISO could provide for those two things in particular some information as to why it believes that this is a problem or causing problems to projects to linger, or I mean, how many projects really go through suspension, or and given the limitations CAISO's just put out there, or how many why are TP deliverability transfers a problem? Why are they not a benefit? So because make those rights be used. So it would be good for purposes of discussions in the workshop if the CAISO could provide some information for that. And then the other comment I just want to throw out there is the issue of projects lingering in the queue. Now I know that projects now are supposed to provide updates, quarterly updates, I think, and maybe monthly or more frequent ones once they start construction. And I wonder what if the CAISO could provide some information about the kinds of review or enforcement of those updates. For example, I know there are projects that have CODs within a year that are continuing to provide updates to the CAISO. It's very clear they haven't started construction. What happens to the CAISO? I mean, what does the CAISO do with that information? If they ever come back and say, well, you're clearly not going to make your COD, so you have to do something like request an extension. What exactly, if the CAISO could just provide some more information on how it treats the information it already has through these progress reports and what kind of enforcement happens there, I think that would be also beneficial to have for the working groups.
Yeah, Susan, I hear you loud and clear, and we'll bring some level of description and explanation of why and some of these processes in the work groups. Appreciate it.
That would be great. And the only other thing I want to say is on the limited operations study, yay, it'd be great. It's nice to have 9 months instead of 5 months. It would be good to have some, if there are some MMA requests that have to be made after that, just for an assessment of whether they would impact the limited operations study that's been performed, instead of just automatically voiding the study. That would, a little bit of nuance there would be helpful. I think we could discuss that in the working groups as well, and as well as potentially longer timelines. So anyway, but that certainly was a suggestion heading in the right direction, and we appreciate that.
Yeah, I hear you on the LOS and MMA. We'll take that back and clarify.
Thank you.
All right, we have a question from Shashank for us. Go ahead.
I had a similar comment on LOS and MMA relationship. So yeah, if you could follow up on that. I have a request for the working group session. Jason, if queue management can gather some statistics or data around MMAs for the workshop, that would be great. And the intent here is, are there common set of modifications like inverter changes or specific equipment changes that never fail in MMAs? And could that offer us some nuggets for simplifying the MMA evaluation itself? So if we can have any empirical data around that would be very helpful. Thanks.
Yeah, Sushant, we can certainly produce something, over the past 2 years or so. Are you looking at just respective to the data, MMA data you're looking for? Are you thinking what types of requests have been made?
Right. So not the,
obviously we can do things.
Yeah, not like detailed modeling data, but
sure.
Let's say there were X number of MMAs that changed inverters, and I'm guessing that's going to be the most common one. And if maybe it nudges us to think about, could there be pre-approved inverters every year or every couple of years, where if those requests come in, CAISO doesn't have to spend as much time on evaluating those, or certain type of transformers, GSUs that get changed, or gen-tie routes that get changed within a reasonable tolerance. Could those be easy, quick MMA changes?
Yeah, understandable, Sushant. So that's a lot of what we considered in the discussions of this topic, I suppose, is at what point do all the final changes need to be made? And if we've never declined an inverter change, then is there value in not requiring an MMA right up front to do that? So yes, to answer your question, we'll bring some data, we'll bring some information, and certainly want to hear your ideas on what's needed and when.
Thank you. Yep.
Thanks, Sushant.
Kathleen Colbert, go ahead.
Thank you, Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. And thanks so much to the team and to Jason for bringing these ideas forward. Well, first, so maybe stay on topic of the LOS and the MMA. The inverter MMA one is a good example. It's one of the examples that I had rolling around in my head as well. I latched onto a very specific sentence in this section. The no active MMA request can be in process when the LOS request is submitted. I think it, first of all, I'll second Susan's, yay, 9 months is great. I think that's increasing the amount of time that we can get the request in. This is one of the most exciting things to read in the paper. The sentence I referenced before, though, you know, when we've been talking about the resource constraints, and I just have to be honest, from experience, it raised a concern with me that there could be an active MMA open that we're just waiting for it to be approved, right? It's just taking longer, and I just would ask the CAISO to think about the fact that, you know, this is another part of the fact that there's a lot of things happening and we're limited in resources. So maybe there is a gray area that accomplishes what you're trying to put forward that I'd like to discuss the working group is, instead of saying no active MMA requests could be in place, no new MMA requests could be submitted after the LOS has been requested. That might just make us a little more comfortable that it's something we can control, as opposed to it's something that it's not in our control, we're just waiting. Does that make sense?
Kathleen, yeah, that makes complete sense. I think it's just language and details we can work on in the working group.
That would be awesome. Thank you. And like I said, this was really welcomed and really appreciate it. I'm trying, you know, as a developer, there's a lot of trade-offs that are involved in evaluating everything that you included in this section. So we're going to go through it in detail and try to be very principled and prudent. With that said, I wanted to give some initial feedback that every single thing you teed up seems very reasonable and ripe for discussion. I'm looking forward to digging into the details. I think those details will matter. Some of what Rayanne was discussing with the 7-year versus a little longer, honestly, I was trying to read your paper, assuming that there was, you know, the intention in that section that something outside of the developer's control, if it causes an extension, there would be another gray area and kind of understanding of that when you were talking about the PTO extensions. And maybe that's something else we can tease out and put a finer point on, but that's something I assumed as I read it and wanted to ask for clarity if that's a part of what you were thinking as the guiding principle.
I believe the answer is yes to that, you know, PTO extensions would be a consideration here. And we're getting into a little more of the work group discussions than I think what we want to here. So if we can, I just want to make sure we're focused on the problem statement here. Yeah, but happy to continue this conversation in the working groups and in the detailed discussions.
Completely understand. It's hard. There was so much detail in this paper.
There is.
And so we had a lot of, you know, responses. So completely, well, I understand. I will leave the rest of my comments. Those were kind of the big picture reactions that I had, and I'm looking forward to talking through them all. I hope that you'll spend extra time on the one-time withdrawal as well. And a piece of information that I'd like to ask you to unpack at the working group is, I was having a hard time without spending a lot of time myself doing a side-by-side of what does that difference mean in the change to the risks and the cost exposures, status quo versus what you're proposing. And if you could spend some time in the working group explaining that, that would be helpful.
Okay.
Thanks. This is really helpful.
Yeah, thank you, Kathleen.
All right, Rayanne Quadro, go ahead.
Hi, I'll be really quick. I just wanted to point out that I put a link in the chat to the place where the CAISO publishes its current MMA reports, which include cost, timing, type, and pass-fail information. I think that might be a good start for Shashank and anybody else that's interested in that data.
Yeah. Thanks, Rayanne. Appreciate you doing that. And
then we do have, go ahead.
I was just going to say, Aisha, the comment you had here on where the 9 months came from. The 9 months was a proposal from the ISO. And we can get into the details in the discussions, but the best way to frame it is, from an operational perspective, we can only go so far out to do an accurate operational study to determine the extent to which a project can achieve commercial operation before an upgrade is completed. And so that 9 months is really the outside window that we determined. And we can discuss and debate details later, but that's the answer.
And then there was another note in the chat from Alan Combs with New Consulting. It says, you'll need to define what you mean by study complete. I think you mean you have a P2 study, but material things occur afterwards that are not queue management issues. One being delivery allocation process goes on for several years, and two being restudies can occur every year throughout COD and impact your cost, responsibility, and timeline. Are these items part of problem 1 or 2?
Yes. A little bit of both, I would say.
All right, well, thank you, Jason. I'm not seeing any other questions or comments in the queue at this time. All right, so.
Okay, yeah. Caitlin, I'll toss it back to you. Thank you.
Okay, great. Next slide, please. All right, so I'll close out today's meeting with next steps. I do just want to give a brief opportunity to see if there's any final comments from our team, any last minute questions before we close out today's meeting.
I'll say something at the very, very end, Caitlin, in terms of any other, after your comments.
All right, sounds good. Well, then we'll move on to the next slide. So here you'll see the proposed initiative schedule for IPE 2023 Track 2 at the moment. You'll see there at the top, the discussion paper was posted on May 31st, and today we had our stakeholder call to talk about the discussion paper. And so we'll be asking for stakeholder comment on June 14th. The comment template is live. And then below that, you'll see our working group schedule. First one being June 20th through June 20th through June 21st. And then the following working groups after that. And all of this is really aiming to get us to that Board of Governors meeting in December 2023. Next slide, please. And so much of today's discussion has really been focused on, these upcoming working groups and how you all can prepare. And I think we've really answered a lot of those questions today. So again, we're looking for high-level comments, people to let us know if they have proposals or want to give presentations during those working groups. And this is really going to help us formulate those conversations over the next month or so and help us get to that next paper. And again, comments are due June 14th. The upcoming working group, June 20th and 21st, we're going to offer a hybrid approach for that. So if you are interested in meeting in person, there is a registration link that we did provide in some of our daily briefing notices this week. But that link, again, is here included in the presentation if you need to grab it on the initiative webpage. But please register if you do plan to attend in person by end of day June 16th. Next slide, please. we'll drill it in. Again, the comments are due July 14th. And I know a lot of folks have been looking for the presentation and the commenting tool today. So that link there in the middle at the second bullet, that is where all of this information is housed. You'll be able to pull up today's presentation, access the comment template, or if you need to register to create an account, you'll be able to do so through there. If you run into any issues or you have any questions, go ahead and send an email to isostakeholderaffairs@CAISO.com. And then next slide. And this is a quick little plug to just please check out the Energy Matters blog. Our latest article is on the 2023 Summer Loads and Resources Assessment. That has been posted. And before I hand it over to Joanne real quick, I think we do have a clarifying question from Ryan Millard with Next Era Energy Resources. So maybe we can open up the line real quick.
Hey, this is Ryan. Thanks for taking my question. I'm looking at the template right now, and I think I'm getting confused again because question 5 is seeking input on whether we'd like to present a proposal on an alternative methodology for accomplishing the principles. And then you're asking for a summary of that proposal. I'm struggling a bit with that because I feel like now we're going to get back into providing way more detail on reform topics that we would like to see. And I don't know where that fits. I feel like that's a working group discussion, but I also feel like providing you with the proposal outline is now getting into a lot more detail that you're not looking for on this round. So can you clarify exactly what you're looking for as far as presenting? Because I think NextEra is interested in presenting. I just don't know that it's yet. I think maybe once we start diving into reforms, that's when we might like to start talking.
Ryan, that's a helpful comment, and I can appreciate some of the confusion that you all are feeling. I think this has been a helpful conversation for us to get a sense of where stakeholders are in the process, and I think just at least based on initial chatter and feedback from you all, it seems like we're probably not ready to go into proposals so soon at the next working group. So I think you can sort of deprioritize that last question on proposals. What we want to emphasize at the next, I think we'll probably have to spend more time talking about it at the next work group, is getting really clear on the principles and the problem statements so that you all can use those when you're thinking through your proposals. So I don't want that to dissuade you from putting forward an idea that you might have that we can consider, but this will not be your last opportunity to say, I have a proposal that I want to discuss. We'll definitely, we'll wait until we get really clear on the principles and problem statements before we do any kind of like final call for any sort of proposals or feedback. We realize now we have a little farther to go on that.
Okay, great. That's really helpful because I need to impart this on my team who are all looking for opportunities to present. I don't know that this is necessarily where we want to, but we certainly want to engage and be active in those conversations. So thanks for clarifying.
All right, well, thanks again to all of our presenters and our wonderful stakeholders and conversation today. I'll hand it back over to you, Joanne.
Great, thanks, Caitlin. So I just wanted to say, I think today's conversation was, extremely valuable, and this is exactly the kind of conversation that we were looking for to sort of see how we should construct the working groups and what would be the most value and the most beneficial. So in the next week or so, we will put together some guidelines as to what we expect in the first couple of working groups so that you can prepare. But essentially, all the comments we heard is sort of going to inform us as to what really we need to focus on in this first working group. So I think it's highly valuable, really appreciate the feedback of stakeholders. It sounds like we're going to have really good, robust discussion and really good engagement by stakeholders. And I think to Kathleen's point earlier about making sure we have the right audience, we do want to make sure we really reach all of the right individuals that have a stake in this. And so we may even do some specific outreach to make sure we're getting all of the right parties engaged so that we don't miss you know, a specific problem or challenge that we're not addressing, and it comes up as a surprise later. So the idea behind these working groups is we sort of uncover any surprises and prevent that from happening further on. But I think everybody recognizes significant reform is needed in this space, and so we appreciate and welcome all of your feedback and as we get into solution space going forward. So thank you very much, and thanks to the ISO team for putting this together. All right. And with that, go ahead, Caitlin.
Have a good rest of your day. Thank you all.
Excuse me, this is Bob Emmert. Before we disengage, I was just informed that the Cluster 15 requests are now published on the Interconnection webpage.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Bob.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.
All right, that concludes our conference. Thank you for using event services. You may now disconnect.